Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the genuinely fascinating story of how a medical doctor, of all people, created the very first blueprint for understanding modern economics. It's this wild tale full of biological metaphors, 18th century royal courts, and a revolutionary diagram that literally changed how we view wealth forever.
Now, you might be wondering, what on earth does an 18th century king's physician have to do with how we measure the modern economy? I know, it sounds like the setup to a bizarre historical joke, but it's actually a completely serious question. How did Francois Quesnay, a surgeon and personal physician to King Louis XV's highly influential mistress, Madame de Pompadour, how did this guy end up shaping modern capitalism, our global supply chains, and the GDP metrics that run our world today? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the disease he was trying to cure.
Which brings us to part 1, the doctor's economic diagnosis, bleeding the economy dry.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We're in mid-18th century France. The country is completely bogged down with a massive deficit from the 7 Years' War. We're talking over 2 billion livres by 1764. The peasants are struggling under these heavy, regressive taxes, and famines are just a recurring nightmare. The reigning economic system was completely failing them. So Quesnay decides to step in and diagnose the kingdom exactly like he'd diagnose a patient on his operating table. At the time, the prevailing economic doctrine was mercantilism. Under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the French state basically believed that wealth was just a static pile of hoarded gold and silver, scraped together through state-directed manufacturing, export surpluses, and heavy tariffs. But Quesnay and a circle of thinkers, who eventually became known as the physiocrats, they totally challenged this. They argued that real wealth isn't a hoard of gold in a vault. No, real wealth actually grows from the earth. To them, agriculture was the absolutely essential, true source of a net surplus.
And here is where Quesnay's medical background really changes history. He was heavily inspired by William Harvey's famous 1628 discovery of blood circulation. So Quesnay looks at the French economy and he sees a living, breathing organism. In his mind, money and goods were literally the circulating blood sustaining the national body, which meant hoarding gold, exactly what the mercantilists wanted to do, was the economic equivalent of blocking a major artery. For a nation to actually be healthy, its wealth has to constantly and freely circulate.
Because he viewed the economy as this biological body, Quesnay believed it had a natural order, and more importantly, that it could heal itself if just left alone. This whole concept actually led to a term coined within his circle that you absolutely know: Laissez Faire, Laissez Passer. It literally translates to let do, let pass. The physiocrats aggressively championed this doctrine of non-interference. They argued that the economy functions best without artificial state regulations, without tariffs, and without trade barriers. Just let the blood flow naturally.
Let's move on to part 2, the 3 economic classes: the heart, the body, and the parasite. To understand exactly how this economic blood flows, we really need to look at the anatomy of Quesnay's model. He essentially divided society into 3 vital organs, or classes, based entirely on their specific role in producing and distributing wealth. First up, you have the productive class. That's your farmers and laborers. Because they work directly with nature, he argued they're the only ones who actually create a net surplus. Second, you have the proprietary class, the landlords and the king. Now, they don't produce anything, but they own the land, they receive the surplus as rent, and then they pump it back into the economy through their spending. Finally, we have what Quesnay called the sterile class, the artisans, merchants, and manufacturers. Now, a quick aside here, he didn't mean sterile as an insult. He simply meant that while, say, an artisan can turn raw leather into a pair of boots, they're really just transforming existing materials. They aren't generating a brand new biological surplus straight from the earth.
And that brings us to the absolute heart of physiocratic thought, the produit net, or net product. This is the surplus left over after a farmer subtracts their annual advances, stuff like seeds, tools, and labor. In Quesnay's ideal state of equilibrium, if a farmer advances, say, 600 million leaves into the earth, nature's bounty yields 1,200 million. Half of that replaces the advances to keep the farm running for the next year, and the other half, a clean 100% return, is the pure, unadulterated surplus that feeds the entire rest of society.
All right, part 3, the great zigzag, tracking the monetary circuit.
To show the world exactly how this surplus moves through those three classes, Quesnay published his masterpiece in 1758, the Tableau économique. It's this incredibly complex network of financial veins and arteries that quickly became famous for its distinct zigzag pattern. Let's walk through how this circuit builds step by step. Step 1 starts with the landlords. They take their rent cash and inject it right into the economy by buying food from farmers and luxury goods from artisans. Step 2 kicks off the actual zigzag process, where the productive and sterile sectors just constantly spend money back and forth on each other's goods. Then, in Step 3, once the everyday spending stops, both sectors enter the capital stage, setting aside exactly what they need to produce again the following year. Finally, Step 4. The farmers use that capital to grow new grain, sell it, and use the cash to pay rent straight back to the landlords. Boom! The cycle closes and it's ready to begin all over again.
Let's look just a little bit closer at those actual zigzagging exchanges right in the middle of that sequence. The zig happens when the agricultural sector buys crafts from the artisans. This can be direct, like the farmer just buying a tool, or indirect, when the farmer pays a laborer who then goes and buys crafts. The zag is when the manufacturing sector buys grain from the farmers. Again, either directly to eat or indirectly through merchants buying up grain to export. It is this endless, multiplier-style ping-pong match of economic interdependence.
Now, what is truly revolutionary about this whole thing is that Quesnay wasn't just sketching out some basic barter system where people trade chickens for shoes. Not at all. He mapped a true sequential monetary circuit. A single, fixed amount of cash has to carry these goods sequentially through the system. Like a transaction actually has to finish before that specific cash can be reused for the very next step. If a landlord decides to hoard their money, or if an artisan buys way too many foreign imports, guess what? The blood stops flowing, the cycle breaks, and the entire nation's economic health plummets.
Which leads us to part 4, Inspiring Adam Smith, From France to the Wealth of Nations.
Quesnay's biological economic breakthrough didn't just stay isolated in France. It actually crossed the English Channel and fundamentally shaped the mind of a legendary Scottish thinker. So after Quesnay published the Tableau in 1758, a traveling thinker named Adam Smith meets up with a physiocrat circle in the Parisian salons during the 1760s. Smith totally absorbs their ideas, heads back home, and in 1776 publishes The Wealth of Nations, which we all know is basically the foundational text of modern economics. And this chain reaction started by the doctor just keeps going, all the way into the 1930s with modern economic models, which we'll actually touch on in just a second.
But first, what's really fascinating is how Smith took Quesnay's work and evolved it. Smith deeply admired the physiocrats' highly systematic approach, and he fully adopted their whole attitude of laissez faire. But, and this is a big but, Smith strongly disagreed with Quesnay's rigid class divisions. Smith didn't think artisans and merchants were sterile at all. He believed that self-interest in the invisible hand of the market created immense value across all sectors, not just down on the farm. So Smith essentially took Quesnay's circulatory system and expanded it to cover the entire body.
Next up, Part 5, Modern Input-Output Models, the Evolution of Circulation.
Fast forward a couple of centuries, and we can clearly see the ultimate mathematical evolution of Quesnay's 18th century zigzag drawing, bringing us squarely into the modern era. Enter Wassily Leontief.
He's an economist who literally won the Nobel Prize for transforming Quesnay's basic concept of class flows into the modern input-output model. Leontief built this massive, complex matrix equation, x equals a times x plus y, which mathematically represents the incredibly intricate interdependencies of every single industry in a national economy. So it's no longer just three basic classes, it's a hyper-detailed map of the entire modern world.
And here is how Leontief's matrix actually works in practice. The columns display the monetary value of inputs an industry needs to function, while the rows represent the value of its outputs sold to others. Just like Quesnay's farmers and artisans relying on each other back in the 1700s, this matrix mathematically proves that one sector's output is always another sector's input. Today, we even use this exact same framework to perform environmentally extended analysis, tracking things like the hidden carbon footprint embedded deep in our global supply chains. It really is the ultimate circulatory map.
Finally, Part 6, the legacy of circulation, from blood flow to GDP.
As we wrap up this explainer, let's tie it all together. How does an 18th century medical doctor's chart directly connect to the digital tools running our 21st century world? Well, without François Quesnay's biological metaphor, we simply wouldn't have modern economics as we know it. His Tableau was the very first model to actually trace macroeconomic circulation. It totally shattered the old mercantilist illusion that wealth is just hoarded gold, proving instead that wealth is this active, ongoing process of production. And most importantly, it laid the direct groundwork for modern national accounting and GDP. Because of Quesnay, governments today can map complex supply chains, foresee economic blockages, and rigorously test how policy impacts will ripple through the economy.
Which leaves us with this final, rather vital question. If we take Quesnay's core premise seriously, that our economy is a living, breathing, profoundly interconnected organism, how are we actually managing its health today? When we face rampant inflation, massive supply chain breakdowns, or looming environmental crises, are we actually treating the underlying disease in the circulatory system, or are we just masking the symptoms? Keep questioning how our world works, and remember that sometimes the absolute best way to understand the economy is to think exactly like a doctor. Thanks so much for joining me in this explainer.